Have you ever wondered why, at certain moments in your life, things don't quite seem right? The world may be moving forward, people may be rushing around, and yet there's a quiet stillness within you. A stillness that doesn't quite match the busyness around you. It's in these moments that God is trying to speak to you. Once when we were changing the clothes in her little room, she still came in and took one of my patients by the hand and said, "We often look for signs and guidance in the world around us, searching for answers in the noise and chaos of our daily lives. Yet one of the most profound truths is that the divine, the presence of God, is always with us, always near, whether we realize it or not. The presence of the divine is not something distant, something far beyond our grasp or comprehension. It is not a mere abstraction or an idea we visit only when we are in need or in moments of profound crisis. Instead, it is a constant, ever-present force that surrounds us, inhabits our lives, and beckons us to listen. The challenge, then, is not in the existence of God's presence, but in our ability to recognize it and respond to it. The divine is not an aloof being who sits apart from us, watching from a distance, indifferent to our struggles. Instead, it is a presence that permeates every part of our existence, moving within the fabric of our days. Whether in moments of joy, sorrow, triumph, or defeat, God's presence remains steadfast, waiting for us to open ourselves to it. The world around us is filled with signs of this presence, if we only have the eyes to see and the hearts to feel. But we often fail to recognize the divine presence, especially in the busyness of our lives. Our days are filled with tasks, distractions, and the constant hum of activity. We rush from one thing to the next, rarely pausing to reflect on the deeper truths that lie beneath the surface of our experiences. We are conditioned to seek answers in external things, in achievements, in possessions, in the validation of others. We are taught to measure our worth by external markers of success, and to place our value in what we do, how much we accumulate, and how others perceive us. In this frenzy of striving, we often miss the stillness in which God's presence resides. God's presence is not a loud, commanding force that demands our attention. It is subtle, gentle, and quiet. It does not announce itself with fanfare or force its way into our lives. Instead, it quietly waits, always present, always available, but only accessible to those who make room for it. It is in the silence between our thoughts, in the pause between our words, that we might begin to feel the stirrings of the divine. That we might begin to feel the stirrings of the divine. These moments of stillness are not empty. They are filled with the presence of something greater, something that cannot be captured by mere words or understood through intellectual reasoning alone. It is a presence that touches us at the deepest level of our being, a presence that speaks to our souls. When we speak of the presence of God, something that resides within the once life's world and is woven into the fabric of our lives, something that resides within us and around us, that is part of our very nature. The divine is not a stranger. It is a part of our very nature. The divine is not a stranger. It is a part of our very nature. It is woven into the fabric of our lives, into every breath we take, every step we make. It is in our relationships, in the beauty of the natural world, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the deep recesses of our hearts. The challenge, then, is not in the presence of God, but in our awareness of it. We must cultivate a sense of mindfulness, an awareness of the divine that exists in all things. We must learn to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, to see the hand of the divine in the small moments of life, in the people we meet, in the experiences we have. This requires a shift in how we view the world, a shift away from seeing everything as merely a series of events and circumstances that happen to us, and towards seeing everything as part of a larger, more profound purpose. When we begin to see the world through the lens of God's presence, everything changes. The mundane becomes sacred, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. But even more than this, the divine presence is one of intimacy and relationship. God does not require us to be perfect or to have everything figured out. Instead, God invites us into a space of trust and vulnerability, where we can be honest with ourselves and with the divine. In this space, we are invited to experience not just God's presence, but God's love and grace, unconditional and ever-present. God's presence is not something we earn or deserve. It is a gift, freely given, available to all who are willing to receive it. It is not limited to the devout or the righteous, but is available to everyone, regardless of where they are on their spiritual journey. In fact, the very act of seeking the divine is a recognition that we are not alone, that we are part of something greater than ourselves, and that we are held in the arms of a love that transcends all understanding. To be in the presence of God is to experience a deep sense of belonging, a recognition that we are known, seen, and loved as we are. Yet even with this constant, ever-present divine presence, we often feel distant from God. We may feel alone, abandoned, or lost, unsure of where God is in our lives. This feeling of separation is not a reflection of God's absence, but of our inability to recognize God's presence. It is easy to feel as though we are disconnected, especially when we are overwhelmed by the noise of the world or the pain of our circumstance. But even in these moments, God is present, though it may be difficult to sense. The presence of God is not contingent on our emotions or our circumstances. It is constant and unchanging, even when we cannot perceive it. In times of difficulty, when we feel most distant from God, it is important to remember that the divine presence is often found in the places we least expect it, in the quiet, in the stillness, in the depths of our sorrow and confusion. God does not abandon us in our suffering. Rather, God meets us in our pain, offering comfort and hope, even when we cannot see it. It is in these moments of vulnerability that God's presence becomes most real to us, offering a solace that nothing else can provide. When we begin to recognize the constant presence of God in our lives, we can begin to shift our perspective. We no longer see ourselves as isolated, disconnected beings, but as part of a larger, interconnected whole. The presence of God becomes a reminder that we are never alone, that we are always supported, always held in the embrace of the divine. We are part of a greater story, a story that transcends time and space, a story that transcends time and space, a story that is unfolding right here, right now. And in this story, we are not just passive observers, but active participants, invited to engage with the divine in every moment. As we learn to attune ourselves to the presence of God, we are transformed. We begin to see the world differently, to see others differently, and to see ourselves differently. The presence of God opens our eyes to the beauty and sacredness of life, even in its messiness and imperfection. It reminds us that every moment is an opportunity to encounter the divine, and that our lives are filled with meaning, purpose, and possibility. In the end, the presence of God is not something we must search for as though it is hidden or distant. It is already here, already within us and around us, waiting for us to open our hearts and minds to it. The challenge is not in finding God, but in recognizing that God is already present right where we are. And when we do recognize this presence, our lives are transformed in ways we cannot yet imagine. There are moments in life when everything seems to fall apart. Times when what we once considered certain begins to crumble. In these moments, we are often confronted with discomfort, confusion, and a sense of loss. It is easy in these times to feel abandoned, as though the world is against us. However, it is during these very disruptions that God is often speaking the loudest. These moments are not merely random occurrences or misfortunes, but invitations to pause. We often take for granted the familiar patterns of our lives. Day after day, we walk through the motions, believing we have control over the direction of our lives. But life as we know it is never truly in our hands. Things happen unexpectedly. Relationships change. Opportunities slip away. Dreams are deferred. These moments of discomfort, though painful, have a deeper purpose. They are not signs of God's absence, but rather signs of His presence, calling us to reevaluate, to listen more carefully, and to reawaken to a truth that we may have neglected. It is through these disruptions that God can speak the clearest. When everything is going smoothly, we tend to forget to listen. We are caught up in our own successes, our own ambitions, and our own sense of control. We don't often make room for the divine when we feel comfortable and secure. It is only when our plans fail, when the certainty of life slips away, that we realize how little we have actually been listening. Discomfort, whether in the form of loss, failure, or disappointment, forces us to confront something much deeper within ourselves. It pulls us away from the surface of life and forces us to look inward, to question what we truly value, and to seek what we may have lost sight of. These are the moments when God speaks in ways that may not be immediately comfortable, but are always filled with a deeper wisdom. The feeling of being uprooted can be painful, but it also offers an opportunity for growth. Just as a tree's roots are strengthened when it is uprooted and replanted in new soil, so too are we transformed in moments of discomfort. God does not cause our pain, but He uses it to shape us, to refine our character, and to redirect us towards something greater. These disruptions are not setbacks. They are invitations to step into something new, to explore new possibilities, and to trust that even in our discomfort, there is a purpose unfolding. One of the greatest challenges of disruption is our immediate instinct to resist. We want things to go back to how they were. We long for stability and predictability. But in resisting the discomfort, we often miss the message that is being offered. We fail to see that the God, in His infinite wisdom, is using this moment to teach us something we could not have learned otherwise. It is easy to look at life's disruptions as signs of failure or loss, but in reality, they are opportunities for deeper understanding and transformation. When we accept the discomfort and open ourselves to the possibility that it may be a divine message, we allow ourselves to grow and evolve in ways we could never have anticipated. In times of discomfort, we may feel like we are wandering without direction, but God's voice often speaks most clearly in these moments of uncertainty. When we feel lost, we are actually being guided to a new understanding. We may not always understand why things are happening or where they are leading us, but we must trust that there is a greater plan in motion, one that we are a part of. Disruption challenges us to surrender our need for control and to trust that even in our discomfort, God is present, guiding and transforming us for something greater. It is through these moments that our character is shaped, our faith is strengthened, and our hearts are open to new possibilities. The divine speaks to us not just in our successes, but in our struggles, It is in the disruption that we often find the space for God to speak to us most clearly. There is a profound truth that often escapes our notice. God speaks to us constantly, but the ability to hear him requires us to be open, alert, and actively listening. It is easy to overlook the subtle nudges, the quiet whispers, and the moments of divine intervention that punctuate our lives, because we are often so caught up in our own concern. To listen requires more than passive awareness. It requires a willingness to pay attention to the deeper currents of life that move beneath the surface of our daily routines. God speaks to us, but we must be ready to hear, to make space in our hearts, and to actively listen with our entire being. We live in a world that demands constant attention. The noise of modern life, be it the endless stream of messages, the constant bombardment of information, or the never-ending demands on our time, often drowns out the quiet voice of God. We rush from one task to the next, our minds filled with worry, our hearts preoccupied with our own desires and ambition. In this whirlwind, it is easy to forget that God is speaking to us, not with thunderous words or grand gestures, but with a quiet presence that we must choose to tune into. Listening to God is not a passive act. It is not something that happens to us while we are distracted or indifferent. To listen actively means that we make a conscious decision to turn our attention toward the divine, to create space for God to speak, and to be open to whatever form his message may take. It requires us to still our minds, to quiet our hearts, and to be willing to surrender our expectations. Listening means we are not just waiting for an answer to our specific questions, but are open to the full range of communication that God desires to share with us. At times we expect God's voice to come in the form of clear and unmistakable signs. We long for dramatic moments of revelation, moments in which the heavens part and we are given a direct answer or instruction. Yet God's communication often comes in quieter, more subtle ways. It may come through the words of a friend, the beauty of nature, a song that resonates deeply within our souls, or a sudden insight that arises in the stillness of our hearts. These moments may not seem significant in the grand scheme of things, but they are often the very ways in which God is speaking to us. To hear these messages, we must be attentive to the world around us, to the people in our lives, and to the inner stirrings that occur when we pause to listen. The challenge of listening is that it requires us to be present. In a world filled with distractions, presence can feel like a rare commodity. We are constantly pulled in multiple directions, our thoughts scattered, our thoughts divided. To listen to God, we must first learn to be fully present in the moment, to tune out the noise, and to be still enough to hear the subtle promptings of the divine. Presence is not just a matter of being physically there. It is a matter of being mentally and emotionally engaged in the here and now. It means putting aside our plans, our worries, and our desires in order to be fully aware of what is happening in the present moment, to be attuned to the ways in which God is speaking. Listening to God also requires us to be patient. In our modern world, we have grown accustomed to instant answers and immediate gratification. We expect to have our questions answered right away, to receive clear and concise guidance whenever we ask for it. But God does not always respond in the way we expect. Nor does he always answer our questions on our timeline. Sometimes the answers we seek come gradually, unfolding over time. Or perhaps we are given only part of the picture, with the rest remaining hidden until the right moment. The divine speaks not on our schedule, but in his own time. Listening means we must cultivate the patience to trust that God's timing is perfect, even when we do not understand why things are unfolding the way they are. It is easy to become discouraged when we feel as though our prayers are not being answered, or when we sense that God is silent. But silence is not the absence of God's voice. It is often an invitation to listen more deeply, to trust more fully, and to wait more patiently. There is a wisdom in silence, a space for reflection and growth that cannot be found in the noise of constant activity. During these times of silence, God is not absent, but rather He is preparing us to hear more clearly, to understand more deeply, and to respond more fully when the time comes. Listening to God also involves a certain level of vulnerability. To listen means to be open to the possibility that we may not always hear what we want to hear. We may be called to change course, to let go of old beliefs, or to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Listening requires humility, the willingness to admit that we do not have all the answers and that we need guidance. It requires the courage to listen to God's voice, even when it challenges us, even when it leads us in directions we did not anticipate. Sometimes God speaks to us through discomfort, through challenges that push us beyond our limits, and through circumstances that force us to rely on Him in ways we might not have chosen for ourselves. But it is precisely in these moments of vulnerability that we often hear God most clearly. For it is when we are most open, most receptive, that we are able to hear His voice. One of the most important aspects of listening to God is learning to discern His voice amidst the many voices that compete for our attention. We are constantly surrounded by messages from the world around us. Voices of fear, voices of doubt, voices of worldly ambition and desire. These voices can drown out the quiet whisper of God. And it is often difficult to distinguish His voice from all the other competing voices. To listen requires discernment, the ability to sift through the noise and to recognize the voice of the divine. This is not something that happens overnight. It is a skill that is developed over time, through practice, reflection, and a deepening relationship with God. As we grow in our faith, we become more attuned to His voice, learning to recognize it in the stillness of our hearts, in the circumstances of our lives, and in the wisdom of His Word. Listening to God is not a passive activity, it is an active choice to turn toward Him, to seek Him in every aspect of our lives, and to be open to His guidance. It requires us to make space for the divine in our hearts and minds, to step away from the distractions of the world, and to give our full attention to the quiet prompting. When we listen actively, we are not only hearing God's voice, but also responding to it, allowing it to shape our thoughts, our actions, and our very lives. To listen is to open ourselves to transformation, to be changed by the voice that calls us into deeper relationship, into greater love, and into a more profound understanding of who we are and who we are meant to be. The way in which God speaks to us is often not what we expect. In our minds, we may envision a grand, thunderous proclamation, a moment of dramatic revelation that shakes us to our core. Yet time and again, God chooses to communicate in forms that are far more subtle and nuanced. We may look for signs in the sky or in the loud and spectacular, but God often speaks in whispers, in quiet moments, and in the seemingly ordinary experiences of life. The language of the divine does not always conform to our expectations. Instead, it invites us to open our hearts and minds to a deeper understanding of how God's presence is woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. For many of us, the expectation is that God will speak in ways that are obvious and unmistakable. We want clarity, certainty, and undeniable signs that point us in the right direction. Yet God's ways of speaking are often more complex, more intimate, and more woven into the natural rhythms of life. He does not always reveal himself through grand gestures, but often through quiet, subtle movements that we might otherwise overlook. The sound of the wind through the trees, the sight of the sunset, the unexpected kindness of a stranger. These are the forms in which God speaks to us. His language is often one of beauty, peace, and invitation, drawing us closer to Him in ways we might not have anticipated. The divine is not confined to specific moments of revelation. It is present in the everyday, in the simplest acts of life. God speaks to us through the people we encounter, through the love we experience, and through the lessons we learn in our interactions with the world. The beauty of nature, the seasons that pass, the rhythm of the day. These are all part of the divine language. When we learn to see the world as an expression of God's communication, we begin to hear His voice more clearly. Every flower that blooms, every bird that sings, every star that lights the night sky can be a message from God if we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. In fact, one of the most powerful ways God speaks to us is through the inner stirrings of our hearts. Often we think of communication as something external, something we hear with our ears or see with our eyes. But God's voice is also internal, moving within us in the form of feelings, thoughts, intuitions, and deep convictions. These inner promptings may seem ordinary, even inconsequential, but they can carry profound meaning. A sudden sense of peace when making a difficult decision, a deep conviction to reach out to someone in need, or a quiet assurance that all will be well. These are the moments when God speaks through our hearts, guiding us in ways that transcend our logical understanding. His voice is not always a loud command, but often a quiet affirmation or a nudge towards something greater. The language of God is also one of paradox. At times His words may not make immediate sense, and the paths He leads us down may appear unclear or even difficult. We may experience frustration or confusion in trying to understand His will for us, especially when the road ahead seems uncertain. Yet, it is often in these moments of confusion that God speaks most profoundly. When we are willing to let go of our need for certainty and control, we open ourselves to the possibility of deeper revelation. God's language is not one of rigid logic or linear paths, but one that requires trust, patience, and an openness to the unfolding of His plan. The willingness to embrace mystery, to accept that we may not always understand the full picture, is often the key to hearing God's voice more clearly. Furthermore, the language of the divine is often one of invitation. God does not simply speak to us to inform us or to direct our actions. He speaks to invite us into a relationship with Him. The messages He sends are not just instructions, but opportunities for us to draw closer to Him, to deepen our faith, and to grow in love. God's communication is always an invitation to more intimacy, more understanding, and more transformation. His voice is not just a tool to guide us through life's challenges, but a call to come deeper into His presence, to be transformed by His love, and to become more fully who we were created to be. As we learn to recognize and understand the many forms in which God speaks, we begin to experience a greater sense of connection with the divine. We come to realize that God is always communicating with us, not just in moments of crisis or when we ask for guidance, but throughout our entire lives. His voice is not confined to the pages of Scripture or to moments of prayer. It is woven into every moment, every experience, every interaction. To hear God's voice is to open ourselves to the richness of life, to the divine presence that surrounds us and moves within us, even when we do not expect it. Ultimately, the language of God invites us to listen more deeply, to see more clearly, and to be more attuned to the ways in which His presence is revealed in the world around us. It calls us to move beyond our expectations and our limited understanding, to embrace the mystery and wonder of how God communicates, and to trust that, even in the quietest of whispers, His message is one of love, guidance, and invitation. Through this deeper listening, we are drawn closer to God, and our lives are transformed by the richness of His divine language.